Hello everyone and welcome back to Kobean History. In today's video of medieval professions, we will be having a look at the medieval Gong farmer. Well, I call this show medieval professions, but as usual I will also go further past the Middle Ages into the modern ages. The Gong farmer is someone who removes and collects human waste from privies, chamber pots and cesspits, and they also dispose of the waste, and it can also be used as fertilizer. This term for the profession, the Gong farmer, arose in Tudor England, and the word gong referred to both the privy and its contents. It derives from the Old English word gangan, not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it means to go. And gang can also mean a journey or a passage. And even though this specific term for the profession arose in Tudor England, the profession itself was much older than that, because dung had always been a good fertilizer. But yeah, that was a little look into what the name of the profession meant, but now we will go into what the profession was actually like. Because the profession was so off-putting to the public, Gong farmers were generally only allowed to work at night, and thus people also referred to them as nightmen, and the contents they collected was also sometimes called night soil, which is I guess a nicer name. Cesspits were often placed under cellar floors or in the yard of a house, and some privies, if they were higher up, had wooden chutes attached to them to transport the human waste from the upper floors to the cesspit below. And sometimes rainwater was used to flush these chutes to keep them relatively clean, I guess. The bottom of the cesspit was not watertight, allowing most of the liquids to drain into the ground and leaving the solids to be collected by the Gong farmer. The foul odor from the cesspits could form a problem for the people living in the house, as you might imagine, and the accumulation of solid waste created a need for them to be cleaned out every 2 years or so. When the need arose, the Gong farmers were ready to dig out the cesspit and remove the waste. Alongside the private privies of the residents, larger towns usually also provided public toilets, which became known as houses of easement. But these were limited. Towards the end of the 14th century in London, for example, there were only 16 houses of easements for a population of 30,000. After the Gong farmer had dug out the cesspit, usually with the help of a couple of young boys to get to the harder to reach places, the solid waste was transported in barrels or pipes, which were then loaded into a cart. They then had to take it outside of the boundary of the town, or alternatively they could also dump it at dumpsites which were allocated by the town, which were usually on or near the edges of the town or village itself. Much of London's waste was taken to dumps on the banks of the River Thames, from which it was transported by ships to be used elsewhere as fertilizer on fields. One of these dump sites was known as Dung Wharf, which was later the site of the Mermaid Theatre and nowadays is a business park near Blackfriars Pier. Some of the dumps became quite massive. By 1780, a dump in present-day Clerkenwell in London had an area of 3 hectares, and the area of this dump site was given the ironic name of Mount Pleasant. And this name also has left a mark on the place itself, as you can see with this place name. As a little side note, there are quite a lot of places named Mount Pleasant around the world, and a lot of them were given the name ironically, like this one. There were penalties for not disposing of the waste appropriately, and these could be harsh. There was a case in London of a Gong farmer who poured the waste out in a drain on the streets. He was uncaught, and his sentence for the crime was to be put in one of his own pipes, and this pipe was then filled up to the neck in waste. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he was also being displayed publicly in Golden Lane, so the people could see his punishment. From the early 1600s onwards, a new profession began to appear alongside the Gong farmers, mainly in larger towns and cities. The people who worked in this profession became known as scavengers. These people were employed to clean the filth that ended up in the streets, which most commonly was caused by overflowing privies or contents of chamber pots that were thrown out of the windows into the streets. It was illegal in most places to throw filth on the streets, but people continued to do it anyway, so that's why this profession was needed. And again, this profession as scavenger is separate from gong farmers. Gong farmers, even though they worked in terrible conditions, they were paid quite well. Those employed at Hampton Court during the time of Queen Elizabeth I were paid 6 pence a day, which was a good wage in that period. And the general gong farmers charged 2 shillings per ton of waste that they removed from the general cesspit. But to be honest, in my opinion, that doesn't really outweigh the awful conditions that they were forced to work in. They are generally considered to have had the worst profession at that time. As if being covered in excrement wasn't enough, there were worse things that gong farmers could come across in the cesspits, such as the rotten corpses of unwanted infants. And I believe this is probably the worst aspect of the job, but there were also some bad restrictions that were put on the gong farmers. They were only allowed to work between the hours of 9 PM to 5 AM. They were only permitted to live in specific areas, and there was even a risk that they would suffocate from the noxious fumes produced by the excrement, and not to mention all of the diseases they would have contracted from working with it. Fewer and fewer cesspits needed to be dug out as the modern sewage disposal systems were invented, such as the pail closets and the water closets, which became widespread in 19th century England. Nowadays, the profession has fallen out of use, and the work of clearing out cesspits is now done mechanically by specialized tankers called vacuum trucks, which suck out the excrement from the cesspits in people's houses. Thanks for watching this episode of Medieval Professions. I'm back from holiday and I did record some videos, but because they are more of a vlog style video, I have decided to upload them to my Patreon. So I made 2 videos. One is a quick tour of Kent, and in the other one we went to the zoo, which was elected the best zoo in Europe. So both of these videos are available to watch on my Patreon from the lowest tier, which is only $1. So if you're interested in having a look at those videos, you can find my Patreon page linked in the description below. I also want to thank Bishop King, who has been supporting me for a few months on Patreon now. So if you want to join him in supporting me, you can follow the link in the description to check out my page.